Hello everyone. So in this final video, which I know all the videos so far have been a bit long, but in this final video, I'll talk about the most famous of Heraclitean notions, and in one sense, very important, is that of flux. And I will talk about flux from first, the famous sort of river fragments, and then I'll bring back the notion of fire that we talked about when we talked about logos. Yep. So the famous river statements, let's start with that. So the famous river statements are, so one fragment says, as they step into the same rivers, other and still other waters flow upon them. Yeah. So the idea that, when you step into a river, you have newer and newer waters flowing. So you for that reason, the second fragment then, that was 12, this is 91, where he says, one cannot step twice into the same river, nor can one grasp any mortal substance in a stable condition, but it scatters and again gathers, it forms and dissolves, and approaches and departs. Like this beautiful fragment where again he's talking about how, you cannot step into the same river because it is constantly scattering, it's gathering, it's forming, it's dissolving, it's approaching, it's departing. And remember the fragment we talked about earlier, it rests by changing. The river remains the river because it is constantly in motion. And this idea of there being this constant flux, and this constant flux is something that is what actually gives it the identity. And that's why I suppose Plato made so much of this, this idea of flux in Heraclitus. And that's why he was very stressed and came up with the theory of forms. That's my theory. That because everything is constantly changing. And in fact, we talked about Cratylus, Heraclitus's follower, who says, you cannot step into the same river even once, because, think about it. The river is constantly changing, but you are also constantly changing. And so if I'm not the same from one moment to the next, the waters in the river, the pebbles, the stones, everything in the river, nothing is the same. So then what am I talking about? Is it the same river at all? Is there anything there? Am I the same at all? Which means that, everything is in constant flux. The whole sort of life is in complete flux, and the world around us is in complete flux. So nothing can hold an identity long enough for me to experience it even once, forget about twice. And so Plato was like, okay, I need something, because otherwise, think about it. This is a very sort of profound question of epistemology as well. How do we have any knowledge? How do we know that it is a river in the first place? How do we have any knowledge of us, even our identity? How do we know that it is still us, if we are constantly changing? How do we know that it is still, the same river? Anything. So the stability of identity is something that, becomes very doubtful with this, if you take this flux doctrine very far. But here, with Heraclitus, when he says that, newer and newer waters flow, what he's basically, I suppose, getting at is the fact that, things are in constant motion. And in fact, Aristotle gives an example of things being in constant motion even when, it looks like they're very stable. So he says that, a rock is worn out when water flows on it continuously. Now, the rock may look the same, and you might think that there is nothing happening, but actually it is constantly changing. It is being worn out by, the water sort of flowing on it constantly. And the idea that when a rock gets split by a plant, by the roots of a plant. Now, again, the plant and the rock looked pretty stable, but then obviously there was that internal tension we talked about in the previous video. There's this internal tension there, in which, at some point, and then that tension was causing that change. There's this constant flux going on inside, which is what makes the rock split at some point, when it reaches that point of, okay, now can't go further. So there is this idea of there being this constant flux, this constant change. And in fact, if you think about it, this flux sort of doctrine, it's a sort of culmination of the Ionian materialist Milesian thinking about reality. Like this matter, this is the river or the human, is constantly changing even though we have a continuity of form. This continuity of form is something that Plato will later go on about. But we have this continuity of form, but we are still sort of, in constant motion. And in fact, even Aristotle, when he talks about potentiality and actuality, he's like, his potentiality is this matter which is in constant flux, and its actuality is the form that it sort of manages to take at any point. So with Heraclitus, we have the sort of, the culmination of really this idea of the potentiality of matter, of this potentiality of this constant flux and change of matter, right? And so the logical outcome really, if we take Heraclitus very, very far, would be this doctrine of uninterrupted flux, in which you cannot step into the same river even once. In fact, later on picked up by Stoics on the one hand, by skeptics also on the other hand, that there can be no knowledge, you can form no knowledge. We can't even know that there can be no knowledge, kind of a thing. And the other side of it, when you go to the opposite end of it, then you have Plato, where you have this idea of eternally existing form. There's this eternal river, form of the river, which has no matter, and that's why it is a river, and that's what holds, and it has to exist separately. In fact, that's where this idealism comes from, that ideas have to exist separately from matter, because matter is constantly changing, and so you cannot grasp it. To grasp it, you need an idea. And so you can see the inception of Western philosophy really in Heraclitus, and this notion of constant flux really. So for Heraclitus, however, now we went too far with Plato and Aristotle and later Nietzsche and Heidegger and everybody. The essence of wisdom, this sophos, this logos, it is in recognizing this eternal motion, this unceasing struggle, this effort of contrary tensions and the necessary conditions for the continuation of this world order. So you have this idea that you have that continuous motion is what makes the world have a particular form. In fact, this is something that, Aristotle did not have that much sort of time for Heraclitus, but still, his idea of becoming is being and being is becoming, it is pretty much something that required this Heraclitean notion of flux to sort of come about. And in fact, you can think of logos as this thing that always held, that holds always, is permanent, everlasting, as being this sort of, the thing that holds this flux together, the thing that holds, everything together. As we have, it rests by changing, right? It rests by changing, it rests by remaining. And even that idea of that potion of barley, wine, and water, it is by being in kinetic motion, in constant movement, that it even holds, it has any consistency. The river has consistency by holding, otherwise it'll just be a still pond, right? The fact that it is a river is because it is constantly moving, otherwise it would not be a river. So I would like to relate this, to end with the idea of, like when he talks about, earlier we talked about it already when we talked about logos, with the idea of the world as an ever-living fire. Now we talked about it in terms of logos at that time, and we said it's not very clear, whether it is a material sort of like arche in the Milesian sense. But when we start thinking about change and flux, now fire is something that is in constant flux, like try to watch a flame, just light a candle and watch a flame in constant flux. Any fire seems to be in constant motion and constant flux. And then he says, if you remember that fragment where he says that, the exchange of all things for fire, as there is for gold, you can get goods for gold and gold for goods, So this idea of exchange, which very anachronistically putting this idea of, E is equal to MC square, energy and matter being in constant change. This idea of fire is of energy, really, of this constant fluctuating dynamic energy, really, being the sort of thing that holds things together. And this idea again of like fire going out in measures and coming back in measures. And in fact, then you have his cosmological fragments, and we will not do a separate sort of thing on cosmology because there isn't that much with Heraclitean cosmology. But you have certain fragments where he says, 31, for example, he says, the reversals of fire, first sea, but of sea half is earth, half lightning storm. And then you have another one, 31b, where he says, sea pours out from earth and it measures up to the same amount as it was before becoming earth. So this idea of transformation of fire, right? Then again, this idea of fire transforming into things, and it gives us a bit of an idea of fire as an arcane, which is why some people do argue it is, which I'm not very convinced by. Or you have fragment 76, where he says, the death of fire is birth for air, and the death of air is birth for water. Now, again, this idea of the fire being, something that that lays at the ground for everything transforming matter, really, as a background for the transforming matter. Or you have the famous fragment that we read earlier, 66, where he says, fire in its progress will catch up all things by surprise and judge them, Then again, this idea of fire catching up, of judging. So when we talked about fire as arcane in the Milesian sense, it is difficult to imagine how it could be, It is an extreme. It does not divide into opposites. You don't have the same kind of an idea. And this ekpyrosis that we talked about with the Stoics, that it goes out in this big conflagration of fire. Then again, it makes it slightly cyclical, right? The idea is that going out in measures, coming back in measures, is that of being kindled and extinguished and kindled and extinguished. So there's this balance of opposites, which the maintenance of the maintenance of cosmic order comes via this fire, kindling and rekindling and going out, and so I think it's more of a metaphor for the simultaneous interaction of contrary forces that tend in opposite directions. Then you have, for example, this fragment, or rather, I can't really find the fragment that I was planning to talk about. But anyway, the idea of fire as having this this primacy in the cosmos, right? This idea of fire as being divine, perpetual life. And it is not sort of permanent. It does not sort of change permanently. Yeah, I found it. Yeah, the one that we were talking about, which was there's an exchange of all things for fire and fire for all things. So it sort of goes through changing through modifications, which is why I'm talking about it again, because it's this permanent physis, it's this permanent nature, this matter, so that it would contradict the law of flux if we think of rest and stability. So fire is something that brings in this flux in everything, right? Because it might appear steady, as I said, in a flame, but it is in fact constantly renewing itself, constantly fueling itself, and by using fuel and giving out heat and sometimes smoke. So it is analogous, I would say, to the river statement. It's like a similar idea to the river statement, where it is simultaneously moving up and down. Like river is moving forward and ever newer waters are flowing. Fire seems to be the same, but it's constantly being rekindled and going out in measures and coming back in measures. And you can relate this then statement also to the idea of the road. The road going up and down, the road up and down is the same. And the idea then of fire being identified with the soul, which we also talked about, this life principle in which the ever-changing nature of the cosmos itself can be understood as fire. It is constantly being rekindled and going out. And so the process of change, the rekindling and going out and going back and measure and, the way up and down, it's all things are, in fact, fire is a great metaphor because, in fact, all things are simultaneously moving up and down. It's not like that, you go up down once and then up again. It's that all matter is transformed. There's a process of transformation of matter, and so it is constantly going up and down. It's constantly changing, and so the cosmos, the macrocosm, as we talked about with Anaximenes, and the microcosm of the soul, we are also constantly changing but remaining the same. So our remaining the same, the dynamism comes through this metaphor of fire. I still think of it as a metaphor. Yeah. Why fire? Aristotle's explanation is that because it's the most subtle element, he says, it nearly approaches the incorporeal. It is in itself in motion, it imparts motion to other things, so it is in constant flux, it's constantly sort of moving. And in that sense, Aristotle says it can be identified with the soul, with the psyche as a vehicle for life. And in that sense, as I said, we can talk about it as being, the sun that never sets. Remember how can you hide from what never sets? In fact, it also is something that is measured. So you have another fragment where he says, the sun will not transgress its measures, if he does, then the Furies will find him out. And he says that the sun is the overseer and sentinel of cycles. It determines the changes and the seasons and everything. So again, this idea of something that is going up and going down and moving, right? And the sun is new every day, right? Now, like some people have thought it to mean that, for Heraclitus, the sun drowns in water and then comes back and renews itself. But I would say that, the way I understand it is that there is the order of the universe, the sun, is like this fire that is rekindled and measures, and that's how, by being renewed every day, by being in flux, by being so dynamic, is how it orders the cosmos, right? It steers all things. And so this testimonial that we have, where he says something like, there's a certain order and fixed time for the change of the cosmos in accordance with some fated necessity. This is this necessity. So I will conclude here, because we've talked a lot about these, and I can continue talking. In fact, we'll do some in our interactive session, where I think we can connect the river statements and the fire statements to think of the flux doctrine and the doctrine of change, as Heraclitus understands it, to understand how. With the river statement, if I can find it again, where he has, it scatters and gathers, forms and dissolves, approaches and departs. Is that actually a river? Right, yes, it's you cannot step into the same river twice, that's where it begins. But this idea of, forms and gathers, scatters, approaches, departs, it's also, I think, the fire, the flame. So you have this idea of flux, which there are two seemingly contradictory metaphors, that of the river, which is constantly flowing, in which ever newer and newer waters flow, and then the flame, which is constantly rekindling and kindling and rekindling itself. And you get the idea of change and continuity and, this flux and, in fact, of becoming, the idea of becoming as being, becoming is being, the fact that change and becoming and potentiality, which later, as Aristotle would call it, is sort of, the essence of all being. And this idea has had such a profound influence on the history of philosophy that, you can trace it to now, it has been one of the most sort of influential ideas in the history of philosophy, I think. Thank you.